Buy this book if you want to know real American history. It's excellent. This is a response video to Shaun's vids, his report on the 1776 report. The 1776 report sucks. It's a narcissistic fantasy. Shaun does a good job of dismantling it. What I would like to do is just give a little pushback. Like, Trump says America is great. Shaun says it sucks. And I'm like, well, first off, I think it's important for people to know the very first person to die in the American Revolution was a black man. His name was Crispus Attucks. Just putting that out there. Okay, in terms of slavery, who was it that implemented slavery in the Americas? It wasn't the United States because the United States didn't exist yet. Putting the institution of slavery at the feet of George Washington is like saying Hitler caused World War I. Slavery was here for hundreds of years before George Washington even existed. So in fact, if the United States had ended slavery during the signing of the Constitution, they would have been changing British law, not American law. And therefore, by keeping slavery going, they were in fact actually just agreeing to continue British practices. I think it's short-sighted at best that he fails to put that in context, while at the same time making mention to the fact that Great Britain outlawed slavery before the United States. It's like, thanks for the cancer, I'm glad you got over it. The Founding Fathers were a mixture of anarchists and fascists, just like today. The phrase Founding Fathers is childish. I understand that he is stuck using the language of the pamphlet while trying to decipher its messaging, but I do wish he would have added a side note that the phrase Founding Fathers is quite silly. It's like BreadTube. Shaun's vids and ContraPoint could not be more different, just as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson could not be more different. Thomas Jefferson was a narcissistic scumbag that liked to talk out of both sides of his mouth, while George Washington was a decent human being. George Washington was not a racist. When he fought in the French Indian War, there were black soldiers fighting alongside him just as bravely as white soldiers, which is why you are hard-pressed to find any statements made by George Washington that can be deemed racist. When he did talk about slavery, he speaks about it strictly as a problem, never as an asset. And as far as his involvement, of course it's inexcusable. There were people alive back then that could see slavery as a crime just as clearly as we do today, which is why it was eventually abolished. But I do believe some nuances in order. In the 1700s, it wasn't economically feasible to own land and not use slave labor. You wouldn't be able to compete. It was common practice. Again, not saying it wasn't a crime, just stating the fact that it was the normative standard at the time. By keeping things in context, my hopes are that people will be able to see the vast difference between Washington and Jefferson. By today's standards, Washington's good deeds don't amount to much, but by 1700 standards, these were in fact bold decisions based on a strong sense of morality. George Washington did not split up families. This costed him money. He didn't do it because he could see the obvious cruelty behind it. His best friend, his constant companion, a man that probably knew him better than anyone else, was black. His name was Billy Lee, and he was famous. Now, Billy really didn't have a choice, and this says more about Washington than it does about Billy, but still the fact remains that these two men were actually quite close. In George Washington's will, he gave all of the people he had in slavery their freedom. He made it upon the death of his wife, and his wife was smart enough to understand that this might inspire one of them to kill her, so she went ahead and gave them their freedom. Now, of course, these people's freedom was short-lived because the law hadn't been changed, and Washington knew this, so there must have been an ulterior motive. What's clear to me is that this was a statement. He did this because he believed that slavery was wrong. Why else would he have done this? If he knew it was foolhardy and that they were all going to fall back into slavery, these people were assets. It's the equivalent of throwing barrels of money out the window. He did it to make a statement. There is no other reason. Now contrast this with Thomas Jefferson's story, and you will see how much of a monster Thomas Jefferson was, and you will see how Washington was very much a man with a dilemma. As far as the Civil War, it was slave traders tricking illiterate people who had never gone more than 10 miles away from their home into thinking that they were being invaded. Honestly, I don't think the rebel soldier ever really understood what the war was about while the fighting was going on. It's very much akin to those idiots bum rushing the Capitol. When people at the Capitol were asked what they were doing, nobody could give a straight answer, just vague, empty slogans like, "It's a revolution." And when the Confederate soldier was asked what they were fighting for, it was very much the same thing. They would just say things like, "My rights." So the number of people actually responsible for the Civil War is quite small. Jefferson Davis, General Lee, Nathan Bedford Forrest, HUD, the senators in the South. You're talking maybe 50 people max, all of whom had slaves. And if General McClellan hadn't been such a coward, the war would have been over as soon as it started. So I don't see the Civil War as a fight over slavery as much as I see it as a small cabal of psychopaths and terrorists tricking the population of the South into fighting and dying to protect these men's own personal wealth, much like Republicans do today. And as far as the genocide of the Native Americans, it's the greatest crime in human history. So it is one way in which we are exceptional. And honestly, I have always been a little bit jealous of Black Americans because they can see through the bullshit. They can see the lies in our history books. For white people, it takes years before they realize that things are fucked up. And a lot of times they just never do. They just fall for that narcissistic fantasy called the American dream, hook, line, and sinker, and just go on wasting their entire lives thinking that it's real. This might be why Black people have more grace. Anyways, if history is written by the victors, then we need to fight like hell.